the stillness of Ward C. Dr. Alistair Finch had always found a peculiar comfort in the night shift. The hushed corridors, the muted glow of the nurse's station, the rhythmic beep of monitors. It was a world stripped of the daytime chaos, leaving only the raw, undeniable pulse of life and death. Alistair nodded, making a mental note to report it to facilities, but his medical brain registered a slight dissonance. The patient in 3B, old Mrs. Albright, was on a stable heart rhythm. No reason for a sudden anomaly. Then came the cold spots. Patches of air in the hallway of Ward C that would suddenly drop several degrees, chilling him to the bone, even with the hospital's notoriously warm heating. The hairs on his arms would prickle, a sensation that made him glance around nervously. He'd check the thermostats, look for open windows. Nothing. He blamed faulty ventilation, a quirk of the old building. But he noticed the night nurses, even Reynolds, sometimes shivered, rubbing their arms, casting quick, uneasy glances into the darker corners. The first truly unnerving incident involved the medication cart. It was a meticulously organized system. Every drug, every dosage accounted for. One night, Alistair was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station when Nurse Davies, a younger, more easily spooked nurse, let out a startled gasp. "Doctor!" "My cart. The syringe for Mr. Henderson's insulin. It's gone." Alistair went over. Indeed, the pre-filled syringe which had been there moments ago was missing. They searched the cart, the floor, the surrounding area. Nothing. It simply wasn't there. 5 minutes later, as Nurse Davies was logging the incident, she gasped again. The syringe was back, resting perfectly, inexplicably on top of the cart where they had looked multiple times. "Must have overlooked it," Alistair stated, his voice firm, projecting calm he didn't quite feel. Nurse Davies, however, was pale, her eyes wide. "Doctor, I swear it wasn't there." Alistair dismissed it as fatigue, the stress of the job, but a small seed of unease was planted. The incident was logged as medication misplacement, resolution found. Hospital bureaucracy, Alistair thought, always preferred a tidy explanation. But the silent alarms continued, not just flickers. Sometimes monitors in unoccupied rooms or rooms with patients in deep, stable sleep would suddenly flatline or spike erratically or show impossible readings, a heart rate of 0 or 300 beats per minute. Alistair would rush in, only to find the patient serene, the monitor reading perfectly normal. It was as if something was toying with the equipment, or perhaps with their perception. The anomalies escalated, subtle yet persistent, gnawing at Alistair's rigid logical framework. For a man who thrived on order and logic, the predictable ebb and flow of the graveyard shift at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was a welcome anchor. Objects began to move. Charts in unoccupied rooms would be found subtly rearranged. The faint, high-pitched hum he'd occasionally heard now became a constant low thrum, seeming to resonate from within the very walls of Ward C, particularly after midnight. It was a painful throb in his ears, an underlying vibration in the air. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They were no longer indistinct. They were voices, sometimes faint, sometimes chillingly direct, calling out fragmented phrases. Here, below, lost, find, find. He heard a child's soft sob, a woman's desperate plea, a man's guttural gasp, always seeming to emanate from the walls themselves or from the dark corners of the rooms. He'd pause his rounds, straining his ears, but they would always fade, replaced by the sterile hum of the hospital. He noticed the night nurses, particularly the newer ones, seemed to be affected. Nurse Thompson, a bright young graduate, started complaining of ringing in her ears and seeing things in her peripheral vision, fleeting dark forms that vanished when she looked directly. Nurse Reynolds, usually so stoic, developed a slight tremor in her hands during the witching hour, her face etched with a weary dread Alistair had never seen. Despite his own escalating fears, Alistair found himself projecting the calm, rational facade of a commanding doctor. Fatigue, nurse. Long shifts get to you. Stay hydrated. Focus on your patients. He heard his own words, flat and authoritative, and they felt like a betrayal of the truth he was experiencing. The feeling of being watched became a constant, suffocating weight. He felt eyes on him from the darkened corners of the patient rooms, from the narrow, silent corridors of Ward C. He'd spin around, his pen ready as a defensive weapon, only to find empty space, cold and still. The fluorescent lights, usually so comforting in their sterile glow, now felt like unblinking eyes, reflecting an unseen presence. He started researching the hospital's history, St. Jude's Memorial. It had been built on the site of an old orphanage, a fact vaguely mentioned in a dusty local history book in the hospital library. The orphanage, St. Benedict's, had burned down in the 1920s, a tragic fire claiming the lives of dozens of children and a few caretakers. The current hospital building was erected shortly after, incorporating some of the original foundation. There were vague mentions of an unstable sub-level structure in the earliest blueprints, a sealed-off section beneath Ward C, listed simply as maintenance access, disused. He'd seen the worst of humanity and the fragility of existence in his 10 years as an emergency physician, hardening him, but never quite dulling his innate empathy. He trusted his senses, his training, his ability to diagnose the tangible. It was unmapped in current schematics. Rumors among the few older, longer-serving maintenance personnel spoke of strange sounds coming from below ground during the early years, particularly after heavy rains. They called it the weeping drains. He pulled a reluctant Nurse Reynolds aside one quiet morning, her shift ending. "Nurse Reynolds, tell me about Ward C and anything you know about what's underneath it." "There are rumors." Reynolds stiffened, her gaze darting around the deserted mess hall. "Doctor, with all due respect, it's just an old building. Old places make noises." "Nurse," Alistair pressed, his voice low, "I'm experiencing things on this ward. We all are, and I need to know if it's connected to whatever history this place has." Reynolds sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. They say some of the children from the orphanage, they were buried right where Ward C is now, before the hospital was built. A mass grave after the fire, just temporary, until they could move them. But they never did. They just built over it. And some say they never left. They're still here, and they don't like being forgotten. Her eyes, for a moment, held a raw, primal terror that Alistair recognized, a mirror of his own growing dread. And then there's the whispers. They say, the whispers. They learn, they mimic, they feed on fear. After that conversation, the whispers in Ward C were no longer just indistinct murmurs. They were voices, direct, personal, mimicking the voices of his patients, of the staff, even of his own past. He heard old Mrs. Albright's voice, frail and confused, calling from her room. "Doctor, it's cold, so cold. Can you hear them? Below?" He'd rush in, only to find her sleeping peacefully, her monitors steady, followed by a faint, guttural chuckle that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his feet. It was using their voices. It was mocking him. He started seeing fleeting shadow figures in the corners of his vision, coalescing for a split second into familiar forms. A small child, a grieving parent, a former patient, before dissolving back into the darkness. His own reflection in the polished steel of an instrument cart seemed to distort, his features twisting into a fleeting grimace, a look of utter despair, before normalizing. It was preying on his mind, twisting his thoughts, trying to isolate him further. Ghosts and shadows were the purview of fevered minds, not the sterile, brightly lit reality of an ICU. St. Jude's itself was an old building, its foundation laid in the early 1900s, with subsequent additions sprawling out like hesitant limbs. He developed a slight tremor in his hands, barely noticeable but present. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. His logical mind, his anchor, was slipping. He barked at his nurses, then immediately regretted it, retreating further into himself. The young nurses, seeing their unflappable doctor unraveling, began to look at him with a mixture of fear and pity. They started avoiding him, their hushed conversations dying the moment he approached. He was truly alone. The entity, whatever it was, knew. It was nurturing his despair, cultivating his isolation. One night, the whispers in the long, empty corridor of Ward C became a cacophony, a swirling vortex of voices, all of them his, all his regrets, all his failures, all the patients he couldn't save. And then, from the depths of the hum, a queer, distinct sound, a child's laugh, the same one he'd heard in his research, the one attributed to the orphanage fire, followed by that guttural chuckle, now louder, more confident. He looked at the crash cart, its defibrillator paddles gleaming under the fluorescent light. He felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to pick them up, to end the torment, to silence the voices. Just end it, Alistair. Peace awaits. He slammed his fists on the nurse's station desk, yelling into the empty air, "Get out of my head! You won't break me!" But the voices only grew louder, mocking him, promising an end to his suffering, promising him understanding. He knew what he had to do. He had to go to the sealed sublevel. He had to understand. He had to face it, whatever it was. He waited until the early hours of the morning when the hospital was at its quietest, the night supervisor making rounds in another wing. He found the old access panel hidden behind a supply closet in Ward C, just as his research had indicated. It was rusted shut, bolted with heavy, ancient locks. Using a forgotten crowbar he found in the janitor's closet, he pried it open, the screech of protesting metal echoing eerily in the silent ward. The air that rushed out was cold, thick with the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness like decaying flowers. The hum vibrated through the floor beneath his boots, a visceral sensation. Most of the critical care and modern facilities were in the newer wings, but the older sections, particularly the long-term care units and the more specialized, less frequently used wards, retained an archaic charm, or, as Alistair was beginning to discover, an unsettling stillness. He descended, flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom, revealing damp, crumbling concrete walls, dripping with condensation. The air grew colder, heavier. The whispers here were deafening, a relentless assault on his mind, weaving around him, urging him deeper. He heard the pleading cries of children, the desperate shouts of adults, all speaking his name, all promising him peace if he just surrendered, if he just listened to their stories. He reached the bottom of the stairwell, a vast, cavernous space. It was not a maintenance area. It was a network of tunnels, ancient, earthen, some shored up with crumbling timbers leading off into absolute darkness. The walls dripped with moisture and the floor was muddy, slick. The hum was overwhelming here, a painful thrumming in his teeth. And everywhere, the cloying scent of sweet decay and damp earth. His flashlight beam swept across the ground. He saw them. Small, faint indentations in the mud, too numerous to count. And then, at the far end of the chamber, where one of the tunnels disappeared into impenetrable blackness, he saw something else. A small wooden toy train, half buried in the mud, its paint faded, its wheels rusted, a child's toy. As he stood at the edge of the muddy chamber, the whispers coalesced, forming a single, multi-tonal voice resonating from the depths of the black tunnel, vibrating through his very being. "Welcome, Doctor. You hear our stories, our pain. We are so many, lost, forgotten." He stumbled back, gasping. He saw it then, in the darkness of the tunnel mouth. Not a distinct shape, but a shimmering distortion, like heat haze, coalescing into a vague, bipedal form, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head too small, and on its torso a faint internal glow, like phosphorescence. This wasn't a ghost, not a demon, it was something else. Something ancient. Something that fed on the echoes of pain, on fear, on the fractured minds of men. It was the collective anguish of all those lost souls trapped and assimilated, forming a singular hungry entity. And it had been calling to him, luring him. He raised his tactical flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness. He aimed it at the shimmering form at the heart of the void. He clicked it on and off, a desperate, illogical act of defiance. The light seemed to briefly flicker within the entity. He'd taken the night shift at St. Jude's 6 months ago, after a particularly draining stint at a high-trauma urban hospital. He craved the quiet, the opportunity for deeper, more focused patient care, away from the constant siren wail. For a split second, the void seemed to shriek, a sound that was pure agony and ancient rage, a million voices screaming in unison, tearing at his sanity. The cold became unbearable, sucking the warmth from his body. The whispers intensified, a furious, vengeful roar, then abruptly ceased. The cold receded. The silence descended. The shimmering form vanished into the darkness of the tunnel. He stood there gasping, the flashlight heavy in his hand, his body trembling uncontrollably. It was gone. He had done something. He had driven it back. But he knew with a horrifying certainty that he hadn't defeated it. You don't defeat something that old, something that fundamental, something that feeds on pain. You only make it angry. And it was still there, slumbering beneath the hospital, waiting. He made it out of the sublevel, scrambling back up the stairs, his body aching, his mind a shattered mess. He replaced the access panel, fumbling with the heavy bolts, his fingers numb. He emerged into the silent, brightly lit ward C, everything appearing perfectly normal, as if nothing had ever happened. He was found hours later slumped at the nurse's station, catatonic. He was quietly transferred to a mental health facility in another city, diagnosed with severe burnout, stress-induced psychosis, and dissociative episodes. They put him on medication, therapy. They tried to fix him. He lives in a small apartment now, in a quiet suburban town, far from any hospitals, far from any old buildings. He avoids silence. He leaves the television on, always, a low hum of white noise to drown out the others. He checks his reflection endlessly, scrutinizing his own face, half expecting it to distort, to show the void. He tells himself it was PTSD, hallucinations, the exhaustion of the night shift, the burden of a traumatic year. He repeats it like a mantra, a fragile shield against the terrifying truth. He clings to logic, to reason, but the shield is riddled with holes. From that day, he still remains thinking about it. He feels the faint, inexplicable cold spots even in the warmth of summer. He sometimes catches the cloying, sweet decay, like decaying flowers, on a breeze or in the stillness of the night. He hears faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, calling his name, promising him oblivion, echoing his deepest regrets, the cries of the lost. The night of the silent alarms was when the quiet began to shift. It started subtly, as these things always do, like a barely perceptible tremor in a familiar melody. Alistair was doing his rounds on Ward C, the geriatric long-term care unit. He scrutinizes the faces of strangers, the expressions of friends, looking for that subtle distortion, that unnatural stretch of a smile, that emptiness in the eyes, that faint vertical blink. He knows it's still there, beneath St. Jude's, slumbering. And he knows, with a horrifying certainty, that he carried a piece of it with him, a resonance that was forever altered, forever open to the echoes of the lost. He escaped the hospital, but he did not escape the entity. He is safe for now. But he is not whole. He is forever haunted by the chilling knowledge that beneath the familiar foundations of our world, ancient, hungry things lie dormant, waiting for the curious, waiting for the isolated, waiting for the pain, forever ensuring that some absences, once experienced, can never truly be filled. And he will always wonder what stories it now whispers, what pain it now feeds upon, and if, one day, its weeping will break through the very ground and reach for him again. It was known for its quiet patients, mostly elderly, often sedated, their lives winding down to a gentle hum. The only sounds usually were the soft snores, the occasional cough, the distant murmur of the nurse's station. Around 2 a.m., the monitors on room 3B flickered. Not a power outage, just a momentary dip, barely a second, but enough for the nurse's station screen to flash a flatline alert before normalizing. Nurse Reynolds, a gruff but experienced woman who'd seen everything, grunted. "Just the old wiring acting up again, doctor." Thanks for watching. The veil between our world and theirs is thinner than you think. Each like, each share, each subscription strengthens the connection. Feed the channel before it feeds on you.